Indian Territory, winter of a killing year. A white wall of blizzard swallows the hills. Snow grains lash like thrown sand. Cottonwoods crack under rime. Creek ice yawns black where current gnaws the banks. In that howl, a widower staggers chest deep through drifts. A swaddled twin, strapped to each side of his body, their cries frosting the air. Elias Mercer, a freighter turned ranch hand, whose wife died in childbirth at dawn, is left afoot when his brother-in-law rides off with the only horse and the food. Wrongly accused of theft by the ranch heir who wants him gone, Elias has no fire, no shelter, and 2 infants sinking toward cold sleep. If the storm doesn't take them, the men hunting him will. A figure resolves out of the white bowstring drawn, but the huntress who finds him doesn't lower the arrow. She says, "Leave the babies and run, or everyone dies." This account survives in 3 scraps of paper that disagree: a mission baptism register with 2 names crossed out, an undertaker's ledger noting "woman unnamed" struck through, and a sheriff's deposition with 1 witness line left blank. Next, you'll see why those erasures cost blood. Elias Mercer moved by counting breaths. He could not trust his eyes. The world was flat white, and the air bit like iron. He counted 1 to 10, then started again, because numbers were the only rails left when tracks blew shut. The twins' breath ticked against his ribs. One cried in thin bleats. The other went quiet, in a way that made him lean his head down, desperate, to feel the tiny mouth warm his coat. He thought of Sarah the moment before dawn, her hand going slack in his. The wind tore that picture and threw it back in his face. He told himself to walk. He told himself not to lay down. Laying down was what the snow wanted. Back at the shallow grave he had dug with a pick that bounced off the frozen ground, he had kissed Sarah's hair and left a scrap of her blue dress knotted to the cottonwood so he could find his way if the storm gave him that small mercy. Silas had said he would ride for help. Silas had gripped his shoulder like a brother and spoken soft. Then Silas had cut the trace horse free, looped the food sack over the horn, and turned the gelding's haunch into the wind. Elias had watched the shape go small and then vanish, like a lie pulled under by a wave. He had not believed it at first. He had waited, shivering at the grave, until the twins' cries turned thin and the world pressed closer. Then he had tied them to himself with Sarah's shawl and staggered toward the creek line he only knew by memory. He was a freighter once. Before the ranch, before the last bad season that killed half the calves and left men angry with no place to lay it, he had hauled sacks of flour and kegs of nails across the same country, reading snow and sun like scripture. Today the scripture blurred. He kept thinking he heard a horse to the left. Then he thought he heard one to the right. The storm took sounds and threw them against him from wrong angles. He kept walking. A small shape flickered in the white. He thought it was a coyote and lifted his head just enough to see. It was nothing. Then it was a shadow again, taller, and the line of a bow came into his sight, like a drawn line of night. He stopped because his legs told him to. The bowstring was taut. The figure's fur hood was rimed with frost. He smelled cedar smoke that could not be there in this much wind, and then found it, a thin ribbon from under a limestone shelf ahead. The huntress stood just inside that mouth of rock and snow and did not lower the bow. Her hair was braided tight under the hood. Her cheeks were burned with cold and grief. He did not know yet. "Leave the babies and run," she said over the wind, in English that held Cherokee cadence, "or everyone dies." Elias shook his head once. His mouth was cracked. His tongue felt like old leather. "I don't run," he said. "Not away." The woman's eyes flicked to the twins. She made a choice. She stepped out into the wind, arrow still knocked, and jerked her chin toward the ledge. "Inside," she said. "Now." Elias stumbled under the rock. The ledge cut the wind at once. The sudden quiet made his ears ring. She moved like snow herself, quick and without waste. She slung the bow, knocked snow from a pile of willow sticks she had tucked dry under rock days before, and set a handful to smolder with a twist of cedar bark. The smoke was thin and sweet, no plume to give them away. Her hands were bare. The skin over her knuckles was cracked. She took one twin, and then the other, checking their faces, pinching their feet through the blankets to pull blood back. The little one, who had gone quiet, let out a mewl when her warm palm covered his mouth and nose. She pressed his feet into the crook of her elbow and used her body heat like medicine. "My name is Elias Mercer," he said, because saying it felt like staking a claim in the world. "My wife," he could not finish. He swallowed hard. "I have to keep them breathing." The woman did not look up. "Breathe for them," she said. "Slow. Match me." She put his hand on the small rib cage and counted with him, low and steady. She made him breathe like a bellows. Fill, hold, let go. So the babies' chests found the rhythm. When they cried, she rubbed their backs with goat fat from a deerskin pouch until the color came less blue and more brown. Wind slid along the rock like a knife on bone. The heat from the smokeless fire licked their hands, but not their faces. He watched her tie rawhide with quick fingers and carve a notch into a stripped sapling. She lashed it to a crossbar and built a cradleboard in the space of a dozen breaths. Then she cut a strip from her own fur-lined coat and wrapped it twice around the twins' bellies. "You're not with them," Elias said. The words came out fog. He meant the men he thought he heard in the storm. "You're not with Vance." At that name she froze for the space of 2 heartbeats. Then she set her jaw. "I am with Winter," she said. "Winter's law is simple. The smallest first. If I break that, the snow remembers." He almost laughed at that because it was true in a way no lawman's decree ever was. The smallest first. He helped hold the babies close to the fire without scorching them. He thought of Sarah again, of the sound her breath made when it was almost gone, like a thread pulling through cloth. He shut his eyes. He opened them because the huntress was up on one knee, head turned. Boot leather in snow is a soft sound if you listen right. She heard it. She slid her bow back into her hand. Elias flattened himself over the twins as shadows pooled at the ledge. A man's outline filled the mouth of the hollow. He held his hat in one hand and a revolver in the other. Snow stung the brim. The man peered in and blinked because the firelight cut his pupils. "Sheriff Bell," the huntress said, her voice low, arrow up, line steady. The sheriff's mouth tightened when he saw the babies. He didn't raise the gun. He weighed things. The wind shoved at his back and made his coat billow. "We got complaint," he said. "Man named Silas Vance says a payroll box is missing, and his brother-in-law rode off with his sister's infants, not 3 hours after she passed. I aim to walk everybody somewhere warm and sort it proper." The huntress's arrow swung a fraction. The tip pointed at his hat brim. "You aim wrong," she said. "Step back." Behind the sheriff, a face leaned into view. The face was clean-shaven and pale. Silas Vance. Snow on his lashes. He tried to look sorry and looked like a man who had practiced and forgot a line. "Elias," he said soft. "Brother, I found help. Come out. Hand me one of those poor babies. You look done in." Elias wanted to crawl into the fire and out the back of the ledge. The babies made small sounds. He saw the horsehair loop on Silas's coat, the nice new buttons bought when the ranch had said there was no money for winter feed. He remembered the way Silas's hand had felt on his shoulder and felt the ghost of that grip like a bruise. "I'm not your brother," Elias said. Silas's eyes went flat. The sheriff's jaw worked. "We ain't doing this in a hole," the lawman said. "There's a line of men out there who'll start shooting from the blind if I don't walk you. Don't make me choose which life to stand in front of." The huntress moved like a hinge. Somewhere in the white behind the sheriff, another man shifted his footing. The huntress loosed. The arrow whispered past the brim of the sheriff's hat and snicked the leather band. The sheriff flinched and stepped back by reflex. Snow and cold flooded in as the bodies outside shifted. "Enough," the sheriff barked, half to his men and half to his fear. "Hold your damned fire." Silas swore. The hired man muttered. The wind took their words and tore them. A minute of shouts and boot scuffle and horse snorts later, the shadows loosened. The sheriff's voice came again, hoarse, the way a man sounds when his hat has just been taught the line between head and bullet. "You've bought yourself till dawn. he said into the ledge. After that, I come in. If a baby is dead, I bury who made it so. The huntress did not answer. She listened until the snow swallowed hoof noises, then let her breath out slow. Her hands shook once and went still. She touched the twins' cheeks. You keep them awake, she said to Elias. Pinch their feet, rub their backs. Sing if you must. Do not let sleep take them. I will be back. She took her bow and stepped into the white like a figure cut out of it. Elias grabbed for her arm because the idea of her leaving made his chest cave. Don't, he said. His throat hurt. You can't see 2 feet. I can see what matters, she said. Stay warm. Count breaths. Then she was gone. He did as she said. He rubbed the twins' backs until his hands ached. He told them the names he and Sarah had whispered when the babies were still only kicks. Isaac for the older by a minute, though no one could tell, and James for the smaller, though they both were small. He told them about a pane of glass in a city he had seen once that shone like a lake. He told them about a spoon of sugar a storekeeper gave him to bring to Sarah when her cough was bad. He told them small bright things, so his voice stayed a rope. The fire ate willow and hissed. He looked at the mouth of the ledge and waited for a shape that did not come. When she came back, he did not hear her until she was beside him, shaking snow out of a bundle. Her cheeks were burned raw. She carried goat fat and a little clay pot of something that smelled like wintergreen. From Tziyo, she said. His feet remember all paths. She rubbed the ointment on the baby's chests and under their noses. Their chests hitched and then settled. She opened a deerskin pouch and took out a carved bone charm. She pressed it into Elias's hand. For your fear, she said. Not because I believe you need it, because sometimes a hand needs weight. What do I call you? He asked. Ahioka, she said. It means she brought happiness. A bad joke this winter. The corner of her mouth twitched without becoming a smile. He nodded. He said her name once like practice. The babies blinked slow and then jerked, startled by a gust that found them. Ahioka set more willow to glow and brought the heat closer without smoke. She showed him a way to hold each twin upright against his chest, so the tiny lungs could work easier. She taught him storm breathing, the kind hunters used when their lungs wanted to clamp and their minds wanted to run. He counted with her again, and the counting made a shape around his panic. When a lull came, she asked, the thing she had to. Why does the sheriff chase you? Do not lie. The snow already knows. Elias told her. He told her about the ranch heir who needed a scapegoat for a missing payroll. He told her how Silas had said the box never made it from the trading post, and how the men had looked at Elias, the outsider who married the boss's sister, the easy one to blame, when winter cut to the bone. He told her he had seen a folded paper in Silas's coat that looked like a bill of sale for something that should not be sold, and how he had said nothing because Sarah was heavy with twins, and he thought silence could buy time. He told her about Sarah's last breath. He told her about the horse cutting loose, and the food bag swinging, and the shape of a man on a gelding, going small. You can't hold life and lie at once, Ahioka said. There was no heat in it, only winter. You know that now. The wind shifted and brought a smell of cold iron that meant a clear dawn would cut them soon. Ahioka's eyes flicked to the mouth of the ledge again. At first light, she said, we move. They will ring the timber when they can see. We will move before they think we can. Elias nodded because he would nod to anything if it meant forward. He tucked the carved bone into his pocket, where Sarah's ribbon lay. He said to the twins he would not let them fall. He said it like a promise, and like a prayer that knew no church. Before the light came, a small thing changed, and with it, everything. One of the twins grew heavier in his arms, a heavy that meant sleep shifting toward the wrong kind. Ahioka saw it the same second he did. She slapped the baby's feet and rubbed hard until he cried. Do not hate me, she told the baby in a voice that broke. Hate me and live. By the time a hard gray seeped through the storm, Ahioka had cut 2 sets of tracks with a branch, ghost paths leading backward toward the cottonwood where Sarah lay, to confuse anyone reading sign. Elias hoisted one twin tight and pulled the other close with rawhide loops that crossed his shoulders. Ayoka took one loop in her hand to keep the baby from slipping if Elias went down. "If I say drop, you drop," she said. "It will be ice." They slid from the ledge into a dawn that was a knife edge. The wind had eased enough to see shapes. The timber was ringed just as she said it would be. Men were dark marks against the white. Silas was a darker mark among them, like spilled ink on a clean page. Ayoka did not go toward them. She went along the limestone face where drifts were thigh-deep, so their bodies made less of a line for eyes to catch. She showed Elias where to put his feet, so the crust would hold a second longer before breaking. He did as she showed. They were almost past the last stand of cedar when a hired man's wool sleeve brushed a limb and shook down snow. The little sound brought a rifle up. The barrel swung. The man saw a shadow where there should be none, and fired without thinking. The bullet did not hit flesh. It hit rawhide. The cradle lash sang and snapped like a twanged wire. The baby on Elias's left side slipped, jolted, and fell into the snow. Elias lunged, a ragged sound broken out of him. He caught a corner of blanket. The baby slid again. Snow caved under them as if it were something alive and eager to pull down. Ayoka moved low and fast, fingers finding the rawhide end and tying it in a knot, even as shots cracked the air in a scatter. "Run!" she hissed, shoving Elias ahead of her, her own body a shield. "Run now!" They ran. 2 men tried to cut them off and went waist-deep in a drift where Ayoka had stepped light. The sheriff shouted at someone to hold their damned fire. Silas shouted at someone else to take the shot because a blizzard makes cowards brave and fools braver. Elias breathed and ran. The twins cried in a way that meant alive. That was all the count he needed. A break in the trees showed black where the creek ate the bank. Ayoka turned for it. "Ice," she said. "Rotten, but fast." She did not ask if he could. She set her body on a line, as if it had always known this path, and yelled once in Cherokee to make the men flinch at a sound they did not know. She ran toward the place where the creek narrowed at the Devil's Ladder, a cut in the bluff where men had hauled deer and contraband since before any ranch flag. The ice was a skin under sleet. Ayoka tested it with a willow stick and listened. A hollow note meant death. A tight note meant a chance. She took the chance. She slid out, weight spread, and held her breath as if that would make her lighter. Elias followed where she pointed. He could hear nothing but his own breath and the twins. He looked down once and saw black water moving like something with a mind. He looked up and saw the mission bell tower in the distance, a wooden cross clotted with snow, and thought if they reached it, maybe a man would stand between them and the men who wanted easy answers. A horse whickered behind. The sheriff's voice came thin on the cold. "Mercer, stop!" It was less order than worry. They did not stop. Ayoka made a small sound in her throat when the ice made a pop like a knuckle. She took Elias's hand and guided his foot from one white patch to another. When they reached snow again, she grabbed his coat at the collar and shoved him toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the mission boundary. "Go," she said. "The bell will talk for you." Father Miguel heard the bell himself because he was the one to ring it. He rang it once, hard. The sound went flat in the cold and came back off the trees. He opened the mission door without waiting to see who it would be, because he had already decided in his soul and would have to lie on paper later. Elias and Ayoka stumbled through. Warmth punched them sharp as pain. The priest took one baby with the skill of a man who had held the dying and the barely living too, many times. He swore in Spanish at the cold and the world, and then gentled his voice to coo as he put the baby's feet against a brick, warmed by the stove. He slid the other twin's hands under his own rope belt to use his heat. "You bring wolves," he said to Ayoka without malice. "But I have a door and a lock." "They bring the wolves," Ayoka said. "We bring the smallest." He nodded at that law. He set them in the sacristy, a small room with rough plaster and saints' faces gone soft with smoke. He barred the door and turned to face the outer one. A knock came hard enough to rattle the latch. Sheriff Bell's voice asked for mercy and then for duty. Father Miguel argued Scripture because Scripture was the only court that would hear this case without coin. Agent Dodd arrived with paper. The paper had lines and seals. He pushed it under the door and spoke of harboring and theft, and the rule that said the government would decide a half-orphan's fate when a man was accused of crime. "Open," he said. "We'll keep them warm. We'll keep them proper. Don't make me put gallows around Charity." Father Miguel bought a day with an old friendship and a promise to write the names in the book. "One day," Dodd said through his teeth. "Then you hand them over for examination." He made it sound like a kind of doctoring instead of something colder. Down in the mission cellar, where lime and old wine kept secrets, Ahioka went to find blankets that didn't smell like mold and came back with something else. A scorched strip of paper had slid behind a barrel. She eased it out and blew the ash off. The ink had run, but not enough. She read the lines and then handed it to Elias without a word. It was a wagon inventory slip from the trading post, listing what had been sold for urgent cash. On the bottom was a quick, proud signature, Silas Vance. Next to it, pay box. Elias held the paper as if it would burn through his hand again. Father Miguel looked at it and then at the door. He set his jaw because he understood that small slips of paper had weight when held by certain kinds of men. "Paper binds those who worship it," Ahioka said, like naming a weather. Elias doubted anyone would care. He had seen men look at cheaper truths and walk past. He looked at the twins, at the pale lashes, and the little fists that opened and shut on nothing. He decided he would care enough for them, if no one else did. Ahioka, who understood two worlds, wrote a short note in syllabary to Tio, with a stub of charcoal she kept in a pouch for marking trails. She wrote where to stand in the trees if things went bad, and how to speak to a lawman who had a conscience, and to the other kind, who only liked how paper sounded when it snapped. She folded the note and sent it with a boy who cleaned the chapel. "Do not run," she told him. "Walk like you are slow. Melt into snow if you must." The boy nodded with eyes too old. Night fell quick. Lanterns moved between the trees like wasps. Silas broke his men from the sheriff's line and circled to the mission's back door with a can of coal oil. The smell of it came through the chinks. The babies stirred at that sharp scent and whimpered. Father Miguel went to the door and said in a steady voice that the first man who put fire to God's house would eat ashes for the rest of his days. Silas laughed. His laugh shook just a little. He sloshed oil against the eaves. Jonah Pike trudged up with a hand sled because he had heard the bell, and bells meant work for his trade. He expected bodies. He found Father Miguel, ash on his face, and a huntress with a bow, and a man with two babies tied to him. He looked at the babies, and then at the door, and added his shoulders to the bucket line before anyone asked. "Not burying those today," he said, almost to himself. He kept saying it under his breath. He was the kind of man who measured hope in the weight of what he didn't have to carry. The eaves caught. Fire licked dry wood and teased up into the dark. Snow fell on it and hissed, but not enough. Father Miguel and Jonah threw water until their hands blistered under wet mittens. Sheriff Bell knocked a pistol from a hired man who was about to shoot into the air for no reason but to feel loud. Agent Dodd stood back where his coat would not smell like smoke and told himself he would write this as civilian disturbance. He practiced writing it in his mind, with no names. Ahioka knew fire was not their only danger. She led Elias and the twins out through a root cellar door into a hard white world that took sound and swallowed it. She left decoy tracks and a cradleboard dummy stuffed with rags to pull eyes the wrong way. She moved like water in winter, finding the line of least harm. Elias followed, his breath a saw. He told himself to set his feet where she set hers. He told himself his legs were not shaking. They reached Devil's Ladder. The cut was narrow. The creek below was a long bruise. Silas and his men were faster than they should have been, with the fire behind them, to want a clean finish. They came up on the far side like wolves, spooked by their own hunger. Silas's voice carried in the cold. "Elias," he called, huffing, "you killed my sister and stole her babies. You're sick in your mind. Hand them over. I will get you help." He let the last word roll like something soft. Jonah Pike came after, slower with the sled, still muttering. Sheriff Bell came too, eyes on Silas, gun down, but not slack. The twins began silent crying, the terrible kind where the mouth is open and no sound comes, because cold has taken the voice. Ayoka stripped her own coat without thinking and wrapped it around them both. She stepped between guns. "If you'll shoot," she said plain, "shoot me." Silas's eyes slid to the ice. He smiled because a certain kind of man loves more than anything to be clever. He lifted his gun and aimed not at hearts but at feet. He shot the ice where it thinned near the black current. The first shot cracked it like glass in a door. The second opened a mouth. The third tore the mouth wide. The creek woke and lunged. The world tipped. The twins slid, as if pulled by a string, toward the black. Ayoka moved first. She dove on her stomach, arms out, grabbing the rawhide lashings like reins. Elias followed without thinking, knee and hand on slick cold, chest on snow, face full of breath that cut. He caught one baby's blanket and felt the weight of water already in it. He hauled, and the ice at his ribs groaned. Ayoka shoved the other tiny body up into Jonah Pike's arms with a strength that came out of grief and turned into something like fury. Jonah, who had measured too many bodies, held this small weight as if it could break and said a word that was half prayer and half curse. On the shattered ice, Elias and Silas grappled. Cold made hands stupid and slow, but hate made them smart. Elias's fist hit bone. Silas's knee caught Elias in the thigh and sent a bright, sick light through his leg. Words broke loose because there was no time left to keep them. Silas admitted what he had done, as if telling it would make it clean. He had sold the payroll and meant to blame Elias. He had planned to leave the twins where the snow would do his work. "Proof of a madman," he said between his teeth, almost proud of the tidy shape of his lie. He said it to hurt. He said it because men like him confess when they think confession will be the last word. Sheriff Bell heard enough to change a life, and maybe two. He stepped forward to put his body where his duty finally pointed. He moved, and the ice made a sound like a bell tolling underwater. He was too late for something he could not stop. The ice under Silas calved clean. Silas's face altered in the little second before fear fully came. He dropped like a stone that didn't want to be a stone. His pale hand smeared under glassy water like a dead moth. The current took him the way winter takes what it wants and does not write it down. Agent Dodd arrived with his coat still neat and tried to make the scene into something his paper could hold. He spoke of hearings. He spoke of custody. He said the word examination again. Jonah Pike, who had no patience left for words, quietly slipped the scorched inventory paper into his own coat, where he kept the stub of a carpenter's pencil. Father Miguel stood with his hands shaking, not from cold, but from the shape of what almost was. He lifted a baby closer to the stove heat and said a psalm under his breath, in a language few men around him understood. The council met in bitter air when the fire was out, and the water froze in the bucket as it was raised. Ayoka stood before men who loved her, and men who loved rules, and sometimes those were the same men. They censured her for breaking custom by bringing an outsider under shelter without the proper words. They offered her a rare honor for saving children anyway, because winter has a law deeper than councils, and every man there knew it. She bowed her head and accepted the weight of both things. Night came down hard. In the mission yard, fox-fat lamps threw low gold circles on trampled snow. Ayoka whispered the twins' names and tied cedar rings to their wrists. Father Miguel dipped his finger in clean water and made a small wet mark on each brow. He wrote their names in the mission book because he believed in records the way a man believes in bread. His hand shook. The ink thickened in the cold. The line of their names lay there, small and brave. Agent Dodd's hand would cross them later, with a careful stroke, as if neatness could make mercy. Sheriff Bell left one witness line blank on the paper he knew he would have to sign, because there was a part of this he did not want to fix, in a shape that could be used against a living soul. He slid a copy of the ledger page to Jonah Pike. Jonah took a carpenter's pencil and wrote a single sentence under the neat columns. Not all names erased stay gone. This account survives in 3 scraps of paper that disagree. A mission baptism register with 2 names crossed out, an undertaker's ledger noting, "Woman unnamed," struck through, and a sheriff's deposition, with 1 witness line, left blank. Next, you will see why those erasures cost blood. Mourning did not bring mercy. It brought paper. Agent Dodd returned with his coat brushed and his hat dry, as if night and fire were stories he had watched from far away. He stood in the mission door and tapped a folded writ against his palm. He asked after Father Miguel's health, as if they were neighbors. Then he set the writ on the table, where the priest's bread knife had just left crumbs, and said the twins would be transferred to government care for examination and placement, pending an inquest and a hearing. He said the words like he'd practiced them in the mirror. Sheriff Bell stood beside him, hat in his hand, his face raw with lack of sleep. He did not look at Elias. He looked at the floorboards the way a man looks at ice he knows won't hold. Ayoka moved to stand between the table and the cradle where the twins lay in Father Miguel's winter shawl. She did not raise her bow. She did not touch her knife. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at the paper. "You wrote this last night," she said, before the babies breathed steady, before any truth had time to stand up. Dodd smiled with no teeth. "The law does not sleep," he said, "and it prefers to keep children where feelings won't cloud judgment." His eyes slid to Father Miguel's baptism book, open to the fresh page, the ink still brown and soft. He let his gaze rest there, a second too long. Then he put a gloved finger on the margin and bent close in a way that made the priest's mouth go thin. "Names are the most dangerous thing," Dodd said lightly. "They make stories think. They're real." Jonah Pike was there with a strip of cloth and a set of rough carpenter's hands that could be gentle when they had to. He had dried his coat by the stove and combed the ice out of his beard with his fingers. He did not like the look of the writ. He liked the look of Dodd's neat gloves less. He took the scorched inventory slip out of his pocket and slid it under the edge of the writ, so the bottom half stuck out like a tongue. The inked signature showed even through the scorch. Silas Vance. Paybox. Sold for urgent cash. Jonah did not say anything. He just moved his thumb so the lawman and the agent could see it. Sheriff Bell looked at the burned paper and then at Elias and then at Dodd. He did not pick it up. He put his hands behind his back so he would not. "Bodies," he said, voice rough. "Turn up downriver after a break like that. I'll want an inquest before any transfer." He looked at Father Miguel. "And the mission will note the baptisms." Dodd's smile thinned. "The mission may note what it pleases," he said. "The government will do the same." He folded the writ careful, set it straight again, and patted it like a obedient dog. "At dusk," he said, "I'll return with a wagon. Mr. Mercer, if you try to run, I will treat it as flight from a charge of theft and abduction. We won't be gentle." After he left, the room felt bigger and worse. The twins breathed in tiny whistles that sounded like kettle steam. Father Miguel shut the door and leaned his forehead against the wood and spoke to God in a low voice that asked less for miracles and more for the strength to do the one decent thing left. Ayoka watched the snow fall heavier again and read the sky the way she had since she was small. "We have hours," she said, "less if the wind turns." Elias stood with a hand on the cradle and tried to count breaths. He could not get past 5. Shame and anger pushed at his ribs. He wanted to hit something. He wanted to sleep for a year. He wanted to hold both babies so close that nothing could ever get at them. He looked at the burnt edge of Silas's name and felt fury move through him like a thaw under ice. He had been quiet when he should have spoken. He would not be quiet now. Sheriff Bell came back after an hour with a man from the coroner's office, red-eared and blinking against the cold. The man brought blue wax and a stamp, like a little winter moon. Downriver, men had found Silas Vance's body caught in a bend where willow roots made a hand to grab whatever came. They pulled him out with a grappling hook, and he looked pale and surprised, as if death had been a rude interruption to a story he thought he was telling. Jonah hitched his sled and went with them, because that was his trade, and because if the dead had to go somewhere, better it be on a board he trusted. The inquest did not wait for light to get better. Winter sets the calendar. They laid Silas on a plank table in a cold room where bottles lined a shelf and a cracked window let in a thin thread of air. The coroner, a small man with careful fingers, checked the lungs and the bruises and wrote neat lines. Sheriff Bell stood equal parts inside and outside himself and asked the questions the law wanted on paper. Accidental drowning, the coroner said at last, tapping the page where the words should sit. Ice broke under feet, cold shock, inhaled water. He looked at the sheriff and then at the cracked window, where wind made a high sound. He picked up a pencil and added in small letters in the margin, in a different hand, a quiet sentence. Ice weakened. He did not say it out loud. He just let the pencil speak, because he knew which words would get erased first if they had to. By noon, the twins had gone hot in turns, the way little bodies do after terrible cold. Father Miguel made a tea from willow bark and mint and touched the cup to their lips with a spoon. Ahioka rubbed their feet and hummed a tune her grandmother used to hum. She did not know the words anymore. She had worn them smooth with use. Elias held Isaac against his chest until the baby's heat didn't feel like a warning, and then switched to James so he could share what warmth a man's body has left when it is emptied by fear. Agent Dodd came early with the wagon. He had 2 soldiers with him, boys still soft around their eyes, and a woman in a gray shawl who worked for the agency and kept a neat book of who came and who went. She folded her hands over her ledger like she was cold. She was the kind of person who wanted to do the right thing and kept being handed the wrong tools. Dodd made introductions and then did not wait for anyone to say yes. He moved to the cradle with a doctor's calm and a butcher's purpose. Sheriff Bell blocked his path without making it feel like a block. "Not until we take statements," he said. "There's a deposition to be made. Many, maybe." Dodd arched a brow, as if this were quaint. "We can take them at the office." "In town," Bell said, as if the extra miles mattered, and because they did. "With a clerk I choose." Dodd's mouth did something small, then smoothed. He nodded as if humoring a child. "By all means," he said. "We'll all go together." They went. The world outside bit their faces and made every breath a little hurt. The soldiers stamped their feet and tried not to stare at Ahioka. She walked at the wagon's back, with her bow unstrung in her hand and her quiver under her coat. Elias rode on the wagon bench with one twin against him under his coat and Father Miguel beside him holding the other, his hands steady, his lips moving now and then, with words that steamed and vanished. Jonah trailed with the sled and the coffin kit strapped down under canvas, because death never waits for one man's story to finish before it starts another. The road into town was a ribbon of ice where wagon wheels had polished snow to glass. Little way past the cottonwood with the blue scrap tied to it, a wolf trotted parallel for a dozen yards, yellow eyes like lanterns at dusk. It did not come close. It watched and then turned back into the trees. Elias watched it go and thought about things that waited at the edges of a life and did not cross the line unless you dropped your guard. At the depot office, where a pot-bellied stove burned, a stink of soft coal and ink froze in the inkwell. If you took your time, Sheriff Bell set the clerk to scratch names and statements. He called Elias first, not because he wanted to frighten him, but because he wanted to sit him near the stove before the baby's noises went wrong. Elias told the story plain. He did not try to make himself look brave, because that is a lie the cold cuts out of a man. He told how the horse was cut loose, and the food went with it, how he had tied the babies to himself, and walked because there was nothing else to do, how a huntress had come out of the white, and said a sentence that had saved his life by making him mad enough to refuse it. The clerk's quill scratched fast. The nib squeaked on a downstroke. The stove popped. The baby hiccuped. Micro sounds stacked into something that felt like a kind of mercy because it meant everything kept moving. Ahyoka told her piece in short lines that sounded like they had been made thinner by wind. She spoke in English and in Cherokee when English did not have a word that meant what she needed. The clerk paused, lost. Father Miguel leaned in and gave the English shape without smoothing the edges too much. Dodd stood at the wall and watched with a mouth that made pity look like a trick. Jonah stood by the door so he could see the street, and also so his breath could stay out in the cold, where words were thinner. When it came time for Sheriff Bell to put his own name to the page, his hand stopped above the line. He left the last witness space blank because there was a piece of this that did not belong to paper. He could not say why. He only knew that if he wrote one more name on that page, the story would change shape into something that would take the twins away for good. The clerk looked up, waiting. Sheriff Bell set the quill down and cleared his throat. "Next," he said. Agent Dodd smiled a new smile that had sharp in it. "We are done with poetry," he said, and held out his arms like a man welcoming guests to a party at his house. "Give me the children." His hands were clean and empty and wrong. Elias felt his body want to move the way it had on the ice. He put his back into the bench and did not give the babies over. Father Miguel stood up too fast and made the chair scrape. Ahyoka did not move. She said quietly, "If you take them, you will need to hold them all night. They do not know your heart. They will choke on their tears." Dodd's patience snapped like a twig under a boot heel. He gestured to the soldiers. They stepped forward, young and uncertain, but willing to do as told. Sheriff Bell moved in a half step and made a wall of himself without drawing his gun. "Easy," he said softly. It was a word to the boys, and to Elias, and to himself. The door banged open. Wind came in like a live thing. Tio filled the frame, snow crusted on his shoulders, the lines in his face deep as creek cuts. He had walked without stopping since dawn. He did not look at the soldiers. He looked at Ahyoka and at the babies, and then at Dodd, with a tired sadness that made the agent step back before he could stop his feet. "Winter is big this year," Tio said, in a voice that carried like a steady drum. "It has taken enough." Dodd laughed a little too loud. "I speak for the law," he said. "You speak for custom." The law carried the day when the fort went up, and the paper came. Tio tilted his head, as if considering a language none of the rest of them knew. "Winter carried the day before forts," he said. "It will carry it after your paper goes to rot." He looked at Sheriff Bell and found a man worth a sentence. "Do not make the snow remember you as a thief of babies." Something shifted then, not big enough to see with eyes, big enough to feel in the pocket of the chest, where a man's bravery lives. Sheriff Bell let out a breath he had been holding since the ledge. "We walk to the mission," he said. "We wait one more night. I will not take them to the agency at dusk. I will not move infants in a freeze to suit a ledger." Dodd's face closed. "You're done," he said, soft as a pocket knife opening. "You just finished your job, Sheriff. You just resigned and didn't know it." Bell nodded once, almost polite. "Maybe," he said, "but I can walk home and sleep." He turned to Jonah. "You'll take the rear. If anyone follows, you make a noise." They left as the light went flat. The wind had teeth again. The street was packed with ruts and the kind of snow that squeaks under boots when it is too cold for comfort. The soldiers hesitated on the threshold of choosing sides and followed Dodd, because that is what boys do when a coat with brass buttons tells them to. The procession strung out along the road toward the mission, long and looped like the tracks of a snake through powder. Halfway there, a shot snapped from the cottonwoods. Not Dodd's men. A hired hand who had peeled off from Silas's line after the fire, a man called Crow for his hair, stepped into the open with a grin like a crack in a plate. He had a long gun and plenty of cold anger left with nowhere to put it. "Debt," he said, "belongs to someone. I'll collect." Ahyoka was in the snow before the echo finished. She did not draw her bow. She had put a river stone in her mitten on the walk for such a moment, and now she threw it with a wrist flick. It hit Crow's knuckles and knocked the rifle sideways. He cursed and fired off into the sky. The bullet made a whine like some invisible animal being hurt. Elias turned his back to the shot without thinking, putting his body between babies and harm. Tio stepped in and took Crow to the ground with the kind of economy that comes from a lifetime walking trails where you do not get a second try. Sheriff Bell kicked the rifle out of reach and tied Crow's wrists with the same rope he had brought to haul kindling. "Jail," he said. After, he did not have room for more justice than that right then. They made it to the mission with no more shots. The room felt warm like a remembered stove when you come in from the yard. Father Miguel set the babies by the bricks again and dipped cloth in water and laid it on tiny foreheads. Ahioka stood with her hands braced on the table and watched the door as if she could hold it shut with will. Elias sat, but the sitting felt like standing with less dignity. Dodd did not try the door that night. Paper can be patient when it thinks it has time. He went to his office and wrote clean lines about a sheriff who had lost his duty, and a priest who had overreached, and a hunter who had interfered in matters that did not concern her. He slept on a cot that did not remember him when he got up, because springs have no loyalty. He got up before first light and made a plan to take the twins without making a scene. He liked neat. He liked quiet. He told himself the babies would be better with regular meals, and no messy attachments to men who made poor choices. In the deep hours, when the lamps burned low and frost built lace on the inside of the mission windows, the twins' fevers broke together like a dam giving, sweat purling on small noses. Father Miguel smiled at nothing and everything. Ahioka put her forehead to the cradleboard and stayed there until her shoulders stopped shaking. Elias slept with his hand on the cedar rings around their little wrists, his fingers curved as if to keep the world off. Jonah put another log on the fire and muttered his mantra. Not burying those today. Just before dawn, the bell rope moved by itself. Wind finds ropes and likes to play. The bell gave one small note that sounded like a coin dropped in a church box. The sound drew a shape out of the dark. Dodd stepped inside with two men and the woman with the ledger. He did not say good morning. He went to the book on the table, the one with last night's page open to the twins' names, written in a hand that had prayed over each letter. He set one gloved finger on the top line. He took out a very neat pen. He drew a careful stroke through both names. He did it as if the neatness might make it kind. The woman with the ledger looked away and bit her lip. Father Miguel's mouth opened and closed without words. Sheriff Bell took one step that was halfway a lunge and stopped because Dodd's men had their hands near their belts and because he was so tired of being the first one to make the wrong shape. Ahioka did not look at the names. She looked at Dodd's hand. She looked long enough to remember the shape of it. She looked long enough to hold it in her mind, the way a tracker holds a hoofprint. "Ink is cheap," she said. "Winter reads bones." Dodd ignored her. He turned to the cradle and picked up one twin with a careful gentleness that would have looked like kindness if you did not know what it cost. The baby woke and made a face, and then began to cry in earnest at the smell of a stranger. The sound went right into Elias's chest, like a blade. Elias stood. He put a hand on his own heart, as if he could steady it from outside. "Please," he said. And the word came out without pride, because pride is a luxury a man with two infants cannot afford. "The law," Dodd said again, and the word suddenly sounded small in the room, like a wire drawn too thin. He nodded to his men. They took the other twin. They moved toward the door. Jonah Pike stood in the doorway without blocking it. He let one arm drop in a way that shifted the weight of his coat. The corner of a little wooden tag showed near his cuff, a tag he used to mark coffins before the bodies went in, to keep names straight. He met Ahioka's eyes, and then Elias's. He did not speak. He did not need to. The plan in that look was simple and wrong, and maybe the only kind left. They followed the wagon toward the agency through a morning that hurt to breathe. The soldiers were awake and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from being told not to talk. Dodd sat straight as a rail and looked ahead at a future that made sense in columns. The woman with the ledger tucked a blanket carefully around one baby and tugged at it again when a draft got in. She hummed without noticing she was humming. The tune had the bones of a lullaby in it and made her eyes go shiny because she had not had a child herself and had stopped letting herself want one. At a bend where cottonwoods make a low cathedral, Jonah let his sled edge closer to the wagon back. He slipped his hand under the canvas and touched the cool lid of the travel coffin he kept ready for weather like this. He had planned it smooth and rubbed it with beeswax the way his father had taught him. He had stacked straw inside for insulation. He murmured to the wood as if wood listens, which it does, in its way. "Hold still," he told it. "Help me lie to a bad story." A teamster up ahead shouted at a wheel that wanted to slide off the track. The road narrowed to dodge a drift. Dodd looked back to tell his men to mind the ditch, and in that small second when his head turned, Jonah moved. He lifted the lid with a speed that did not look like speed. He made a hole no wider than a man's hand. Ahioka, already moving, slid alongside like a shadow and reached for a swaddled bundle with fingers that did not shake. Elias stepped to the wagon at the same time so that anyone looking would see him, not her hand. Father Miguel coughed hard to cover the thin cry that came when cold air touched a small face. The Ibi woman with the ledger pulled her shawl up over her ears against the wind and hummed a shade louder. Dodd turned back, satisfied that the road respected him. They got one twin into the box and laid him in straw. Jonah set a warmed brick near the baby's feet, the way he would for a newborn lamb. He slid the lid down without a sound. He cut a slit in the canvas and threaded a leather thong through so air could find the small lungs hidden where the dead usually go. He did all this with a calm that came from spending years with grief and knowing it could not be hurried or slowed, only held proper. They reached the agency yard. The building was paint-peeling white and held cold the way a grudge does. Dodd climbed down and signaled for the second baby. He kept one under his own coat to make the picture right. He liked pictures. He strode in with the twins in both columns of his mind, the tidy one for reports and the messier one that always came back later, in dreams he did not admit to having. The woman with the ledger followed, her book tight to her belly. The soldiers took up places at the door. Sheriff Bell went last on purpose so the door would have to hit him if it tried to close on the wrong side of a man. Inside, the examination room had a table wiped too clean and a smell of carbolic that promised virtue and delivered distance. A doctor with a dry mustache and careful, impatient hands stepped out from behind a curtain. He said the babies should be weighed and measured, and he would note any defects or marks of overexposure. And the way he said marks made the hair on Elias's arms go up. Elias stood with his hands in fists, because empty hands are dangerous. Ahioka stood at his shoulder and said nothing. Father Miguel took off his hat and put it on the table without being asked, because he had learned places where hats make trouble and places where they make respect. Outside, Jonah slid his sled behind the building and waited in the lee, where the wind fanned smoke from the kitchen. He listened to the room, the way a carpenter listens to joinery for stress. He heard the doctor's voice, light, winter brittle. He heard paper scrape. He heard a baby's downy cry drop out as soon as the little mouth found skin. He looked at the small slit in his canvas, where breath came out in tiny clouds at a steady count, and sighed in a way that sounded like something coming untied inside him. "Not today," he said to whatever cold god takes little ones when it can. The doctor finished his points with his pen and clicked it shut, as if that closed something bigger. He announced the babies were fit enough, but unfortunately warded by the present state, and would be placed temporarily under agency supervision for their own good. Dodd smiled like a man who finds his keys where he left them. He patted the doctor's arm as if partners in a quiet sin. He turned to Sheriff Bell with a face that expected a salute. Sheriff Bell looked at Elias. Instead, he looked at the twins. He looked at Ahioka and at the woman with the ledger whose mouth had gone small and flat, and at Father Miguel, who had leaned forward as if he would step into the doctor's chest if he had to. He said, "No," in a voice that was not loud and not soft, and made something in the doctor's face flicker like a lamp when it is almost out of oil. "We walk them back," Bell said. "If you want to fire me, you do it in daylight on the street, where my neighbors can hear why. Until then, the road is mine." Dodd opened his mouth and closed it and opened it again. He gestured to the soldiers, who hesitated a fraction longer than they would have the night before, because boys learn fast when babies cry in their arms, and priests pray for them by name. "Stop," Dodd said finally, and the words slid on the floor and did not stick. They made it to the door. The woman with the ledger stumbled just enough to make Elias take the baby from her arms to keep him from falling. She let him because she had wanted to since she first picked the child up and felt that small weight decide her future from the inside. Outside, the cold hit like a slap and fixed tears on cheeks. Jonah moved in like a piece in a board game. He tipped the coffin lid, and in one motion, the hidden twin came up into Ayoka's arms, warm from the brick. She held him like a secret and like a victor. For a moment, Joy stood there bareheaded in the frost, small and stubborn, and not to be argued with. Then a whistle lifted from the yard. One of the soldiers had stepped behind the building to piss and found the slit in the canvas and a tiny cloud of breath. He shouted, and the shout called other shouts, and the yard filled with men who liked neat answers and a gun in hand. Dodd came out with his pen still in his grip, like a needle. They ran. Of course they ran. Past the woodpile, past the wash line where shirts hung frozen, like men caught mid-gesture, past a dog that barked once, and then lay its head back down, because dogs know when a night is too cold to care. Sheriff Bell ran in a way that looked like he had decided to start being the man he had thought he was when he took the badge. Father Miguel ran with his coat flapping and his hat lost, somewhere that would make the kids laugh later. Jonah ran pulling the sled low and smooth so it would not catch and spill. Ayoka ran as if winter were something she had learned to outrun by becoming part of it. They cut for the river because there is always a river. The ice there was thicker than the creek, but not as honest. A broad white that held until it didn't. The bridge at the ford was a low run of planks on piles, rhymed with hoarfrost and slick as a lie. Jonas went first with the sled to test the planks. The boards sang under the weight, a note like thin metal. Men with guns shouted at their backs. The twins cried. The world narrowed to wood and breath, and the hollow below where black water moved slow and certain. Halfway across, a plank cracked. Not a big sound. A small dry cough of wood that had been breathing winter too long. The sled hit a gap and tilted. Jonah threw his weight forward and flattened, holding the rope with both hands. Teeth bared in a grimace that was also a smile, because he loved a problem he could solve with muscle and timing. Elias shifted his weight to keep the baby high. Ayoka turned sideways and took 3 quick steps that made the board sing less. Sheriff Bell put a hand on the rail and felt it give under the glove. Behind them, boots thudded, and a young voice shouted, "Halt!" in a way that said the boy hoped they would not. The rail let go. It tore from its post with a crunch and swung like a loose arm. The sled slid sideways toward the open dark. Jonah's heels dug for purchase and found nothing but frost. Ayoka lunged and caught the sled rope. The rope burned her palm and then bit. She set her feet in a way that had kept her alive more than once. Elias leaned too far and felt the board under his boot shiver like a sick animal. The baby in his coat squirmed. Father Miguel locked both arms around Ayoka's waist and gave her a second anchor, because faith is only half prayer and half weight. The plank popped. The sled dropped a foot and hung, half over black. Men on the bank lifted rifles, as if a bullet could negotiate with gravity. Agent Dodd stood on the near side with his pen still in his hand, the nib blotting a dot of ink on the snow, and watched neat turn into ragged. The river took a breath under them like a great animal waking. The bridge made a sound of wood giving up a long-held secret. The babies cried. The rope creaked. The soldiers took a step forward, then back, then forward again, because training doesn't tell you what to do when life and death balance on something a carpenter set up with good intentions 5 summers ago. The cold bit and the light went thin. The next move would choose the rest of their lives. The rope creaked again. Ayoka felt the fibers talk in her palm, the way sinew talks when it is about to part. She bared her teeth and leaned backward, heels grinding frost into the plank, and did a thing her grandmother had taught her when a deer went down in a ravine, and only a gut rope and stubborn will kept meat from wasting. She lowered her center, bent her knees, and stepped 1 foot at a time without giving an inch of pull. Father Miguel's arms around her waist burned like a band of fire. Jonah flattened his chest to the sled and hooked one elbow through the cross stanchion, so that if he slipped, the wood would have to choose whether to take the whole contraption or let the old carpenter be a splint between loss and holding. Elias shifted the baby higher against his ribs, felt the tiny hands open and close on his shirt, and tasted iron in the air from fear and cold, and a nick on his tongue he didn't remember making. "Put the guns down," Sheriff Bell said without taking his eyes from the failing plank. He kept his voice level, because panic presses weight in the wrong places. "You shoot, we all go through." One soldier swallowed and lowered the barrel first. The other followed a breath later, like boys crossing a creek stone by stone. After one proves it will hold. Dodd did not move his pen hand. He looked like a man watching a delicate instrument come out of tune. Ahyoka hissed through her teeth. "Step," she said, and took a half step back while pulling the sled up an inch. The rope sang. Jonah's boots found a groove in the plank where years of feet had worried a shallow trough. He set his heel there and pushed. The sled's runners rasped. Father Miguel grunted, the sound a prayer answering pain. Elias bent his knees and took weight off the board that cracked under him. The plank held like stubborn breath. The river sighed and let them have a heartbeat where nothing moved. Sheriff Bell took that gift and moved with it, sliding to Jonah's side and catching the sled frame with both hands. He did not think about duty or jobs or paper. He thought about a boy who had once fallen through stock tank ice, and the cold that took his legs, and the ranch hand who had pulled him up by his belt as if he were a sack of feed. He thought about a man's debt and how long some kinds of owing last. He hauled. The sled came up enough for both rails to bite wood. Jonah let out a breath that fogged white and laughed once, a short bark without humor that meant his arms had not betrayed him. Behind them, boots pounded the approach. Crow, wrists tied but mouth free, had slipped his rope under a wagon wheel bolt and worried it like a coyote on a snare until it frayed. He came running with a length of chain and spite bright as frost. "End it," he called, swinging the chain low toward Elias's ankles. Ahyoka's head snapped. She couldn't drop the rope and couldn't not. Tio, moving slow to keep his heart from rattling out of rhythm in the cold, stepped into that single narrow lane and lifted his cane. He took the chain on the wood with a crack that splintered the cane and jammed the links back into Crow's shin. Crow went down hard, the noise like a sack of scrap thrown on a barn floor. Sheriff Bell kicked the chain away without looking and jerked his chin at a soldier. "Tie him right this time," he said. The boy obeyed with a competence that comes all at once to the young when they see how quick bad turns worse. "Now," Ahyoka said, and they moved together. Rope strained. Wood complained. The sled climbed like a stubborn thing, remembering it was built for dry. Plank by plank, they inched forward until a post grabbed Jonah's runner like a hand. Bell bent and popped the runner free with a twist that barked his knuckles raw. "Go," he said, and meant it like an order to fate. They did. The last stretch shook. The rail on the far side held when a rail shouldn't. The four of them cleared the worst and slid the sled onto solid snow. The baby's cries pitched up a note that was life wanting more of itself. Elias staggered the last yard and sat down hard, because standing seemed like bragging in front of so much luck. Ahyoka let the rope go one finger at a time, and sat too, because her legs had gone to water. Agent Dodd stood on the near bank and put his pen in his pocket with hands that were steady enough to fool a mirror, but not the winter. He did not shout. He did not shoot. He watched something he did not understand make a shape he could not file. "You'll answer for this," he said finally, too quiet for the river to carry to anyone who mattered. They did not answer him. They crossed the last boards like men and women afraid to wake a sleeping child. On the far side, Tio leaned on the broken cane and nodded once like a man who had seen too many winters to spare much word for victory. Father Miguel touched the forehead of the child in Elias's coat with 2 fingers and made a tiny sign without looking like he had. Jonah patted the sled rail, as if it were a horse that had done something brave. Sheriff Bell unclenched his jaw and found blood where he had bitten his cheek. They did not go back to town. They swung wide, through cottonwoods and brush, tracks braided and doubled, until even a good tracker would have had to choose which rope to follow, and winter was pulling at all of them. The mission took them in like a breath coming home to lungs. The stove sang. The babies quieted the way small fires do when a hand cups them gentle. Father Miguel warmed bricks for the cradle board and used every old trick he had learned watching women older than the church keep tiny lives lit. Dodd came at dusk with men enough to turn a refusal into a scene. The soldiers' faces were drawn the way men's faces are who have been made to run in someone else's argument. Dodd knocked and did not wait to be answered because men with paper believe doors are suggestions. He stepped in and raised his hand as if blessing what he would take. Jonah set himself in the doorway, as if fitting a tenon to a mortise. Sheriff Bell stood shoulder to shoulder with him, badge cold on his vest, and worth less than a man's breath, and more, both at once. Ahyoka took a step that put her between the cradle and everybody else. Tio sat in a chair, with his broken cane across his knees, and gave Dodd the look a winter gives a fire that thinks it has the whole night. Father Miguel did not shout. He went to the baptistry. He opened the book where the names lay line-crossed, like roads denied. He set the page where the lamp could make the paper shine. He poured a little clean water into the shell. He motioned to Elias. "If they will take them," he said, "they will take them with names twice spoken. The sky will remember the sound, even if the ink forgets." Dodd scoffed and called it foolish. The woman with the ledger put her hand on the cover of her book, as if to keep it from me running away. Sheriff Bell did not move. He watched a priest, a hunter, a carpenter, an uncle, and a father stand in a room and make winter listen. Father Miguel touched water to each tiny brow, with hands that did not shake. He spoke the names. He did not hurry. Ahyoka stood with cedar rings ready. She tied each thin wrist again, knots neat, the way a woman ties a loved man's shirt when his fingers are numb. "Winter Mother," Tio said, giving her a story name in the old way. And in that moment, grief inside her moved like a log shifting in a hearth and made room for a new flame. Dodd stepped forward, because a man like him can't bear a ritual he doesn't control. "Enough," he said, and reached for the cradle. Jonah Pike's hand caught his wrist. The undertaker's fingers were hammer-thick and damp with heat from the stove. He didn't squeeze enough to bruise. He squeezed enough to make a point come through glove to skin. "You want to take them?" Jonah said, voice level. "You write that you took them from a priest's hands while he blessed, and from a woman who saved them on the ice, and from a father whose wife is in the ground this same week. You sign it under your own name, full." Dodd looked at the faces arranged against him and saw not warriors, but something worse for a man like him. Witnesses who would not forget. He found the sheriff's eyes and saw no give. He looked at the soldiers and saw boys who would talk. He let his wrist slide out of Jonah's grip, as if he had been the one to finish the touch. He smoothed his sleeve. "You have until morning," he said, "because a retreat is easier if you call it a schedule. Then I come with a proper order and more men." He walked out stiff as a board that has taken too many nails. The door shut. The beating of blood quieted. Father Miguel blew out a long breath that wavered the lamp flame. He closed the book, not to hide the lines, but to keep the page warm. Sheriff Bell leaned against the wall and slid down until he sat on the floor, face in his hands. He laughed once, the kind that cleans something out, then wiped his eyes with the heel of his palm and stood back up because the night still had work to be done. When real dark fell, Ahyoka went out with Tio to the village edge. They spoke in low Cherokee, under a sky brittle with stars. She would be censured. She knew it and accepted it, because some laws bend in winter and some must break. The old women had sent word. If the babies were claimed by the agency in the morning, the ground would claim them by night, not by death, by belonging. There were families who would step in without asking names or papers. Ahyoka listened, then shook her head. "Paper binds those who worship it," she said. "We will bind paper." At first light, Jonah walked into town alone with the sled. He did not take a body. He took the scorched inventory slip flat in his pocket and his ledger under his arm. He went straight to the clerk's office and set both on the desk. "Make a copy," he said. "Then you make another. One for you, one for me, one for whoever eats truth for breakfast." The clerk looked at the undertaker and decided today was the day he got brave, without knowing why. He dipped his pen. By mid-morning, the story had a shape that could not be nudged back into neat. The coroner's inquest with its little pencil note, the wagon inventory with Silas's hurried signature, the sheriff's deposition with one line left blank like a dare to whoever wanted to fill it, all that lay in places where men other than Dodd could see. The woman with the ledger came to the mission with her shawl tight and her jaw set. She asked to hold a baby. Ahioka handed one over without making her beg. The woman pressed her face to the child's hair and stood a long time like that before she stepped back and said, "We misplaced too many," so soft that the wind took the words before the room could. "I can misplace a sheet," she added, voice stronger. "It happens." She looked at Dodd's tidy world and made a small tear at one corner. Dodd arrived with men enough to strip a church bare. He held paper signed by a judge whose seal bit into blue wax, as if that mattered to weather. He walked in and found a room not armored against him, but settled. Father Miguel stood ready with the book. Elias stood with his sons in his arms, and a face that had learned in 1 week the hard work of not flinching. Sheriff Bell stood with his hat off, and his badge pinned crooked, and his resignation already written in his chest, if not yet on paper. Jonah stood with his ledger open to a page where the line, "Woman Unnamed," had been struck through at dawn and replaced with "Sarah Mercer, blankets returned, no charge." Ahioka stood in the doorway, with the bow unstrung in her hand, like a symbol of a war, postponed, not abandoned. Dodd read the order. He reached for a child. Tio tapped his cane twice on the floor. The sound was small, but it carried. "Before the fort," he said to no one and everyone. "Before the paper, a winter like this came. Men died who thought they were big. Babies lived because women carried fire inside their coats. You can take a child to a room and weigh him. You cannot weigh that." Dodd took the baby anyway, because a man with paper only knows one move. He turned toward the door. The woman with the ledger dropped her book. It fell open on the floor to a page where columns became lines and names ran like water. She knelt to pick it up, and her sleeve knocked the inkwell. Ink spilled like a little tide over the order Dodd had set on the table. The blue seal blurred to a bruise. The judge's name bloomed unreadable. She gasped in a way that said accident with just enough theater to be believed. Dodd swore and snatched the paper up and shook it, and wet black drops spotted his cuff like guilt. Sheriff Bell did the boldest thing he had done since taking a badge. He stepped between Dodd and the door and spoke without reaching for a gun. "You'll put that down," he said. "Then you will listen. We have a witness's confession, heard by law, that the theft you pinned on Mercer came from the dead man you want to call a victim. We have your doctor's note these children are fit, and a priest's page that says they belong to a name. You want to fight all that. You do it tomorrow in front of the town, where the men who mend your roof and the women who cook your meat can hear which words you use to make winter mean. Today you back out and leave them where they're warm." Dodd stared, because he did not recognize the sheriff, and because he hated recognizing courage in the wrong man. He looked at the soldiers, boys, suddenly, not just jackets. He looked at the woman with the ledger, who did not look away. He looked at Jonah, whose hands could make a box, and also, if they had to, put a man in it. He looked at Ahioka and saw a winter that would not end just because he asked. He put the paper down because it was wet. He left because he could not make them carry what he would not lift himself. The town fought about it for a month, the kind of fight that weaves itself through chores and meals and saddles until it becomes part of the harness and the way the harness rubs. Dodd sent letters anyway. He threatened to have the mission's privileges revoked, to replace the coroner, to rewrite the sheriff's deposition by dressing it in a different clerk's hand. He found men willing to frown on command. He found fewer willing to knock on a door that had Ahyoka sitting inside it with a bow, and a priest and an undertaker, and a new sheriff, who liked the look of his own reflection less, and the look of his hands more. The twins' fevers stayed down. They learned to latch and to sleep, bundled back to chest, like two birds in a nest, under the eave of a house that holds heat. Elias learned to move without waking them. He learned to pour coffee with his left hand, while his right kept a small back pressed firm to his ribs. He learned that guilt could sit beside love and not eat it if he fed the right one more. He stood sometimes under the cottonwood, where a scrap of blue dress still fluttered like a small flag, and said Sarah's name to the wind. He said Ahyoka's too, not the same way, but with honor hung on it like a weight. The council met again when the snow sagged and turned to sugar and pale water ran in ruts. They lifted the censure from Ahyoka by standing and taking the weight of their fear off her shoulders in the only way men can, by letting themselves be ashamed without making a show of it. They asked her to bless other babies whose mothers had no milk. She did. She did it with hands that knew the feel of cedar and rawhide, and the weight of a bow, and the bones of a small wrist. Women brought baskets to her door, and left meat there when they could. Old men nodded to her and called her Winter Mother, where Dodd could not hear. In spring, when the river went high and brown, and shook branches loose from banks like a big man's laugh, a coffin floated up from a buried snag half a day's walk down from Devil's Ladder. It wasn't Silas's. The undertaker knew every box he built like a father can name his children's steps. Jonah hauled it in anyway and pried it, and inside lay an old story no one had told in a while, another charm against forgetting. He cleaned the wood, let it dry, and planed the lid smooth, and in the shavings he found a kind of peace that comes after a winter that took too much. He went home and wrote a line in his ledger that was not a charge or a name. He wrote, in the neatest hand he could muster, not all names erased, stay gone. Sheriff Bell walked to the agency with his badge on one day in May and set it on Dodd's desk without ceremony. He had planned a speech. It died in his throat when he saw the neat stacks of paper and the ruler laid exactly straight on the edge of a file. You won, Dodd said, smile carved like a notch. For now. Bell shook his head. I quit, he said. That's all. He turned and left before the other man could find a word to throw after him. Later, he took a job mending fences on the East Range, where the wind never stops reminding a man of what line is his to keep. It paid less. He slept better. Father Miguel copied the page with the twins' names and sent the copy to a mission 2 days' ride west, and to a cousin in Santa Fe who kept letters in a little cedar chest lined with lavender. He sent a third to a woman in town who taught children to make their marks with chalk because he believed in scattering truth like seed. Dodd sent a man to fetch the mission book under color of audit. The man came home with the wrong volume, a hymnal so worn the paper felt like cloth. When Dodd tore the hymnal to find a ledger inside, he tore music instead and made a sound that didn't belong to a man used to getting what he wanted. Elias kept working. Men who had treated him like a borrowed mule began to hand him a cup by the handle. Some apologized poorly. He took what they could manage and let the rest blow away. He built a crib with Jonah's help that would hold two without squeezing them into one future. Ahyoka carved new cedar rings when the first ones wore thin from washing and tears. She did not move into Elias's house. She came and went like weather, and the babies learned to laugh when they heard her foot on the threshold. Spring made them wide-eyed and loud. Summer would make them fast. One evening, when swallows cut the air pent and the creek ran sullen between banks of grass and mud, Elias carried the twins to the cottonwood. He tied a fresh scrap of Sarah's dress there, cut smaller from what he'd kept, and set a little clay bowl at the root with a splash of coffee in it, the way he had seen Ahyoka leave water for those who had gone. He spoke out loud, because sometimes prayer needs ears. I tried, he said. When I couldn't, they tried for me. The twins grabbed at the light and at his beard. He laughed, a sound he had not trusted his mouth with since autumn. He felt the land listen, Not kind and not cruel, only there, as it had been before any of them, as it would be after. That winter's shape did not disappear when the thaw came. It stayed in papers and in people. The mission baptism register showed 2 names crossed with a careful line, but the page underneath still bore the indent of the priest's hand, the way a letter leaves a ghost on the sheet below. The coroner's inquest kept its little pencil sentence. The sheriff's deposition kept its blank witness line like a window left open in a house that otherwise felt shut. The undertaker's ledger took on a morale it hadn't asked for, and bore it well. Elias kept the carved bone charm in his pocket until the leather wore smooth around it, then hung it on a nail over the door, at a height his sons would reach when they were 10. If you want the clean version, you can read Dodd's report. It says order and compliance, and proper custody, and later circumstances made continued action unnecessary. If you want the true one, find Jonah Pike's page and Father Miguel's copy, and the woman with the ledger who learned the trick of misplacing the right sheet on the right day. The story survives because 3 scraps of paper disagree, and a handful of people refused to be tidied into the margins. If you've carried this far, listen for the one voice missing from the sheriff's page, and ask yourself whose hand cut the names, and whose kept them legible under the smear. If the ledger speaks again, you'll know which page to open first.